Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Amity Institute of International Studies, I, Sahajan, would like to welcome you all to the second technical session on the theme Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific region. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished chair for the session, Professor Tej Pratap Singh from Banaras Hindu University, and our fellow presenters, which are Ms. Disha Garg from AIIS Noida, Mr. Gaurav Mishra from Doctoral Fellow from ICSSR, Ms. Sumita Karki, Researcher, NICE Nepal, Ms. Disha Garg from AIIS Noida, and finally Ms. Anushka Saxena from LSR Delhi. Also, I'd like to welcome all those who joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on Facebook. We're glad to witness your presence today. Dr. Tej Pratap Singh is a well-renowned professor in the Department of Political Science in Banaras Hindu University, having a keen interest in international relations theory, conflict resolution, and peace. Now, without any further ado, sir, I kindly request you to take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we can hear you.
So, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude towards Amity University and NIICE Nepal for giving me this opportunity to chair this important technical session of this webinar. And my personal thanks to Dr. Srees Pathak, who has been instrumental in bringing me here. So thank you so much, Srees, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
And it's a real pleasure to get connected with the people of Amity University and NIICE Nepal. Amity University, I have been hearing a lot, knowing about it for many years, but somehow I could not get connected with the students or faculty of this university, the prestigious university of the country. So thank you so much for giving me this important opportunity. And this is the session I have been given with the Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific. Very briefly about this concept. In the morning session, I was connected when the keynote address was being delivered by S.D. Muni, sir. So these concepts, Indian Ocean region is a natural concept because Indian Ocean refers to the ocean, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, etc. But the second part, this Indo-Pacific here, like your reimagining of South Asia, and as Professor Muni said, that earlier it was India and its neighborhood, then it was imagined as South Asia, then it was imagined as Southern Asia. So this imagining and reimagining is a continuous process, and it goes on and goes on. Because unlike the Indian Ocean region, the Indo-Pacific is not a hard fact, because when you refer to the Indian Ocean, so there are many oceans. Indian Ocean is one, you know, where it's a geographical expression and it is known to everyone. But as far as Indo-Pacific term is concerned, it is a new concept, though Karl Haushofer was the first person who used this term Indo-Pacific in his writing on geopolitics in 1920. But then it was lost. The credit goes to one naval officer, I'm forgetting his name, sir, probably Gurpreet Khurana, who wrote a paper in 2006 in IDSA journal, Indian Strategic Analysis. And there he discussed about this topic while talking about India-Japan relations, and particularly the security of the sea lane of communication. So he was the first person in contemporary period, the Gurpreet Khurana, this naval officer, in his paper, first he used this word Indo-Pacific. And immediately after that, this word was used by Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, while addressing Indian Parliament. And then it was picked up by Australia in its defense white paper. And then eventually by United States of America, And now this is the most widely used terminology. But it is a contested terminology. Indo-Pacific is a contested terminology, and it is a geopolitical term. And in fact, it is America who has been instrumental in coining, in recreating this kind of terminology. As Muni sir was saying, that South Asia was a geopolitical construct by the American strategic analysts when they divided in their Cold War politics the whole world in different regions, and South Asia was one region. And it is an artificial construct because artificially they kept, as Muni was saying, that Myanmar and culturally and even politically also part of South Asia, part of India's neighborhood. So artificially, it was the Afghanistan was put in the Middle East, in the West Asia, and the Myanmar, the Burma was put in the Southeast Asia. It was done artificially. So these terminology, the South Asia, Southern Asia, etc., these are the products of imagination. And this process of imagination, reimagination, it continues in the geopolitical discourse. So like that, this is the Indo-Pacific. Now, Indo-Pacific, now the United States of America, their strategic community have embraced this word Indo-Pacific. And the Pacific Command, now they have renamed it as Indo-Pacific. China has allergic to this concept, and so far China has deliberately avoided using this term Indo-Pacific. And when America talks about Indo-Pacific strategy, so Chinese interpretation is that this Indo-Pacific strategy is for containment of China. Then for Indo-Pacific, the earlier terminology was Asia-Pacific, and in that Asia-Pacific terminology, India was not finding itself fitted into that terminology. And in the all Asia-Pacific grouping, whether it was Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, or any other. So in many Asia-Pacific oriented organizations, India was kept out. But in the Indo-Pacific concept, in the Indo-Pacific terminology, India occupies the central position. Until this date, this Indo-Pacific terminology, it is still evolving, and all actors, the geopolitical actors who are involved in using these words, they have different meaning of this terminology. While America, when defines the Indo-Pacific, so they extend the western coast of America, the South China Sea, East China Sea, and then South Asia. So their Indo-Pacific ends with the South Asia, with the western coast of India. But India, for its own convenience, has extended it to include the eastern coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Middle East also, because these are also important for our strategic interest. So, so there are various interpretations of this thing, but now within 10 years, within a decade, now the Indo-Pacific terminology has become the most acceptable terminology, and it has virtually replaced the Asia-Pacific. So this is the background of this terminology Indo-Pacific, and just I was looking at the papers. So 5 presentations are here, and a program. While making program, I don't know why Sri Pathak has not been giving the equal time to all. To some he has given 15 minutes, to some he has given 20 minutes. I think it depends upon the length of their paper, etc. Being the chair, I will be giving the equal time to all the paper presenters because I can't make discrimination between them. And so my request to all the paper presenters, it's a diverse paper. It is also on BIMSTEC. BIMSTEC is the sub-regional grouping, and one paper is on India, China, and Indo-Pacific. So there are various kinds of papers are there. Five papers. They are different papers. They are discussing the different topics. So I look forward to listen to the all young paper presenters. I presume all of them are students, so they are very brilliant students. See that their students are doing better than their own teachers here. So it will be pleasure for me to listen to them, and I'm sure they will do well and they will excel. So now over to the first person who's in the list. I've not been able to take out the printout. So I think Sri will help me in announcing the name of the first paper presenter.
It's
And I
Miss
will.
Gargi Sharma, sir. Miss Gargi Sharma.
So, Miss Gargi Sharma, now over to you. So, please make presentation of your paper and kindly adhere to the time given to you, because I'm a very lenient chair. I don't feel very comfortable asking the student to stop their presentation. So, on your own, you self-impose restrictions. So, you conclude the paper within the allocated time. Over to Gargi.
Am I visible, sir?
Yes,
Yeah,
Gargi, you are visible, you are audible.
Very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gargi Sharma, and I'm a student of Masters in International Relations. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Tejpratap Singh, sir, for so much information and his words of wisdom. Sir, I'll try to cover my presentation within 15-20 minutes. I won't take much time. I would also like to thank AIIS, NIICE, and Mulya Foundation for giving all of us this opportunity to be able to listen to all the dignitaries and learn from them. I would be talking about the topic Chinese aggression and Indo-Pacific. So I'll be sharing my screen now. Is it visible, sir?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's visible.
Gargi,
Yeah.
perfectly visible. Yes.
Okay. So in the last couple of months, the world has been facing a deadly pandemic. Uh, the world has been facing a deadly pandemic that has affected nearly 33 million people and killed nearly 1 million people, and brought even the most powerful and rapidly growing economies to a standstill. The virus has unleashed a miserable health crisis, social disruption, and economic devastation on the world. But there's one country who claims to have controlled the virus on its land and its economy, and its economy has not stopped growing, and that is China. In fact, in these cruel times when other countries are coming together in order to support each other, China's neighbors have seen significant changes in the recent behaviors. It has turned more hostile and aggressive towards the other nations. Let's have a look at this slide. There are some of the news headlines from the last couple of months. There is one factor which is common in all of them, and that is involvement of China. Not just that, but an aggressive China towards its neighbors and other distant countries as well. So during this presentation, I will try to answer the 3 points that I came across myself during my presentation. The first one is Chinese aggression. Second, how this aggression is remolding Indo-Pacific. And the third, how will this impact the world order? So, well, the country has been aggressive on both the East China Sea and South China Sea, apart from Sino-Indian border for a decade, since the Chinese President Xi Jinping came to power. But this kind of behavior was least expected at this point of time. From the past few months alone, it is breathing fire on its neighbors, and it had tense geopolitical confrontations with a growing array of neighbors. So it clashed with India, as in areas near Pangong Tso and Galwan Valley in May, June, in one of the worst border flare-ups in decades. The two countries have been fighting the worst border conflict in 4 decades in eastern Ladakh, with the Indo-China border witnessing bloodshed for the first time since 1975. China escalated standoffs with Vietnam and Malaysia in South China Sea. It pressured Taiwan with nighttime drills in the Taiwan Strait and threatened Australia with boycotts of wine, beef, barley, and Chinese students when Australia demanded an investigation about the origins of the virus. There's a bitter trade war going on with US. So, as a result, in June this year, US mission to the United Nations formally submitted a note arguing that China's maritime claims in the South China Sea are inconsistent with international laws, and it formally rejected China's historical right claims in the South China Sea. Now, let us see how this aggression is remolding the Indo-Pacific. Now, as a result, Indo-Pacific powers have become cautious of the Chinese threat. defending the Southeast Asian region and the entire Indo-Pacific. US has given a statement that the international community will not allow Beijing to treat the region as its maritime empire. Indo-Pacific partners are trying to decrease their reliance on China and achieve a closer coordination among themselves. Indian, Japanese, Malaysian, and Australian governments have all taken concrete steps to reduce their economic exposure to Beijing, ranging from investment, manufacturing, and technology. ASEAN foreign ministers also issued one of their strongest statements till date on South China Sea recently and insisted that maritime disputes must be resolved in accordance with the UN Law of Sea Treaty. India and Australia recently signed a new military logistics. Same as with Japan. India has also signed an agreement with Japan. Military logistics agreement named Acquisition and Cross Servicing Agreement will allow armed forces of both sides to coordinate closely in services and supplies. India already has similar agreements with America, France, Oman, and Singapore. Quad. So the countries are wary of China's assault on maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific region. Hence, they are coming up with different initiatives to promote rule-based, open, free, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. The first one is Quad or Quad 2.0. It is a grouping of 4 democracies: India, United States, Japan, and Australia. These countries are working together towards achieving a common goal, which includes maritime domain awareness, cybersecurity, counter-terrorism, information sharing, connectivity, and infrastructure. It was born in 2004 as a collective response to the tsunami, shelved in 2007, and then revived again in 2017. The new version is known as Quad 2.0. They have been increasing cooperation on common issues of concern incrementally. The formation of Quad is a very significant step strategically because it may attempt to control the unchallenged behavior of rogue Chinese Navy in South China Sea and also bring in checks and balances for their naval operations in Indian Pacific region. All the member countries of Quad have recently been targeted in China in one or the other way. Hence, for the first time in Quad's history, the stars might be aligning for a harder line on China, and the implications going forward could be significant. It may be on the verge of taking actions that would strengthen their position as a security group. For instance, air forces of 4 nations can exercise together in Anderson Air Force in Guam soon. The second initiative is Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is taken by the US government. US is a bit more cautious and indulged in taking more concrete steps to counter Chinese aggression and expansionism in the region. Pentagon is going to establish a Pacific Deterrence Initiative modeled after the European Deterrence Initiative, and it would authorize $1.4 billion to go towards capabilities such as missile defense, enhancing forward posture, and improving interoperability with allies and partners. Then there is another group termed as Indo-Pacific Coordination Group by US government again, which includes selected countries including India, America, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. And it promotes cooperation among them in order to fight the pandemic. It seeks to achieve a closer cooperation among countries in Indo-Pacific and bring them on the same page. India in 2019 proposed an Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative for safe, secure, and stable maritime domain. And the focus area include enhancing maritime security, among others. India has consistently been indicating that it was keen on playing a larger role in the region. Now with this, India is stepping up its interaction with the Pacific Island countries and the regional countries. US has also been pushing on for a greater role for India in the Indo-Pacific in an effort to contain China's growing clout. Then there is Indian Ocean Rim Association and ASEAN-led frameworks like East Asia Summit, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and others. So now coming up to the next and the last question, how will this impact the current world order? I think there may be any of the two cases. Let us talk about the first case. The first one is pro-China. COVID-19 outbreak has created an unprecedented situation and challenged the existing world order. No other crisis has been this severe. It is the first global pandemic, whereas all other outbreaks such as plague or Spanish flu were localized affairs. Even the Gulf War did not disrupt the global economy and lives of people in one go like this, and there was no global lockdown and disruption in the economic activities of the nation. In those cases, the nations were still powerful because of their ability to spend on their military force. However, in 2020, nations' economic power and excess money available to invest in other nations is a strong factor to win over the nation's allegiance in international institutions. Governments are confronting a health crisis, economic crisis, and crisis of institutional legitimacy, all at a time of heightening geopolitical rivalry. Now, China has an economic leverage and it will certainly go ahead with this option. It may also think of taking over the present situation, like WHO, present institutions like World Health Organization or United States, where it can create rules that benefit its own interest. Since it was able to contain the spread of COVID ahead of other nations, it might use the fact to address the claim that its own political system is superior to other nations. Now, to create a win-win situation, it may go ahead with both economic and political options. It may also seek to create its new parallel international institutions, like it did with AIIB and BRI. So this is one scenario where China's one-word agenda, global dominance, might be seen replacing US as the global hegemon. And then there is the other situation, which can be pro-US. There's a strong anti-China sentiment in the world now, and Beijing has been taking up conflicts, as we already discussed. So China has a strong grip over South China Sea and ASEAN, among a few others international organizations. However, it is also grappling with internal demands, internal instability, and demands for democracy. It is suspected that US might use the strong anti-China sentiment and the recession to create social upheaval. The international collective of nations might be successful against China's military strength. There's a prevailing international mood against China, which we already saw. So it is an opportunity for other nations to help usher in democracy in the country. But these are just premature predictions. What we are witnessing today is a very sharp contest between US and China for the number one spot to guide economic interest and dictate the world order. This strong contest will last for some time. China's challenge to the US is real but premature. The country is behaving in a frustrating manner, which is both unpredictable and dangerous, but its forward march has been disrupted by COVID. A new coalition of democratic countries in opposition to China's hegemony is already in the process of coming together. However, to what extent will this coalition be able to tame China's assertiveness and expansionist strategy? It is unclear. As per my understanding, there will be a new emerging world order. An economic and diplomatic cold war will erupt between the current global power US and the aggressive competitor China. Now, whatever the new dynamic be, India will have to determine a clear strategy for handling China. It will have to align with nations in the Indo-Pacific region facing a similar challenge from Beijing and form new security architecture to counterbalance the Chinese aggressive behavior. This is all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gargi. Thank you so much for completing your presentation within the stipulated time here. So without wasting much time, because I will be giving the chair remarks at the end of all the presentations. So I will request Sri's to announce the name of the next presenter, and the same request to the another presenter that they are like Gargi, he or she must adhere to the time allocated to the paper presenter. So over to the next presenter. Sri, can you please announce the name?
Yes, sir.
Akash Singh.
Yes, sir. Next presenter is Miss Sumitra Karki. Welcome, Miss Sumitra. Kindly come forward.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the organizing team for providing me this opportunity. I would like to share my screen. Share screen. Yeah. Okay. Slide over.
Yes, PPT is visible.
Okay. My topic is BIMSTEC Hope for Increased Cooperation. And at first, I would like to talk a little bit on rationalism in South Asia. Rationalism in South Asia. Okay. South Asia is a least integrated region which have different political and socio-economic models, and there is strategic rivalry between the members countries. In present times, South Asian region is one of the world's least integrated regions in terms of trade, connectivity, and cooperation. In fact, it was more integrated 50 years ago than it is today. And for reasons largely to do with political differences, it enjoys perhaps the least connectivity and of all regions, very low intra-regional trade, little sharing of energy surplus, and very little intra-regional tourism other than for visiting relatives. The dominant strategic features of the region is the tension and rivalry between India and Pakistan, two powers that have more than once gone to war or to have wars of war and that now have nuclear weapons. Despite its rising economic potential and geostrategic vitality, the region remains largely on the sidelines of key global developments. There were significant differences in the political spheres as well. And if we talk about Nepal and Bhutan, they were ancient kingdoms ruled by powerful dynasties, which did not allow democratic freedom of any sort. And the cost of freedom in the two countries was very different. Apart from a more democratic polity, the initial conditions of Sri Lanka differed from those of the rest of the countries in several other important respects. In region, the region also faces strategic rivalry as it is a vital link for China to access the Indian Ocean region. China has undertaken a massive drive to finance and develop infrastructure through the BRI in almost all South Asian countries except Bhutan and India. If we talk about non-traditional security threats in South Asia, the region also faces several non-traditional security threats such as trafficking of narcotics, weapons and people, the illegal exploitation of natural resources, refugees crisis, emergencies of rebel insurgencies, and terrorist groups and natural disasters as well. And illegal migration is very serious and could give major security threat to the region. And another is human trafficking, which is another serious problem. The trafficking of girls from Nepal to India for forced prostitution is perhaps one of the busiest slave trafficking routes anywhere in the world. If we talk about failure of SAARC and evolution of BIMSTEC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is one of the major regional organizations which gives its participants a platform to interact. It comes into being out of a genuine need for regional integration, but unable to achieve its objective due to several reasons. It has survived numerous disputes between its two leading member states, India and Pakistan, and boost concentrated focus on socio-economic developments. After SAARC has failed to have a matured and successful regionalism and it is entering into coma, the concept of BIMSTEC emerged as a recipe to deepen regional grouping between South and Southeast Asia. The Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectorial Technical and Economic Cooperation was formed for promoting greater connectivity to foster intra-regional trade, investment, technological and cultural exchange, and other connected areas including security. In this regard, BIMSTEC emerged as a more widely scoped organization compared to SAARC. If we talk on opportunity, BIMSTEC could give greater opportunity to the region. Some of common opportunity it could serve to the member countries are it is crucial for economic development. Of course, with a combined GDP of USD 2.7 trillion, BIMSTEC members countries account for 22% of the world's population. The region is rich in natural resources such as hydropower, oil and gas. Since approximately 25% of the global trade goes via the Bay of Bengal, it makes the region economically and strategically important. It gives opportunity to being together. South and Southeast region is another great opportunity for of BIMSTEC. It is a vital phenomenon to fight poverty, and it can give greater visibility in the Indo-Pacific region, and also could generate greater regional connectivity. There are two major developments which have generated renewed hopes for BIMSTEC to become a viable option to forge an effective regional group for the promotion of broader economic integration. First is establishing the BIMSTEC Secretariat in Dhaka in 2014, and second, the leaders' retreat held in Goa, India on October 16, 2016 during the BRICS BIMSTEC Outreach Summit. BIMSTEC region is strategically located at the crossroads of South and Southeast Asian and countries back they used to have deeper connected crossing the land and sea space. In recent times, some of member countries have made significant economic growth and also made notable social advancements in women empowerment, education enrollment, reducing maternal mortality and increasing life expectancy, and so on. The region has a 300 gigawatt regional hydroelectricity potential and also have vast marine resources to the Bay of Bengal, which are yet to be fully mapped and tapped. If you see the country-wise benefit or opportunity for India, the avenue is crucial for projecting its naval capabilities. Economically, it is equally rewarding as BIMSTEC has given rise to greater regional connectivity. Similarly, for Bangladesh, I think it provides an ideal platform for firmly position itself within the Asian and the global orders than just exist as a small state in the Bay of Bengal. For Sri Lanka, it offers connectivity with Southeast Asia, which can enable it to be become the center for Southeast Asian interaction with the Indo-Pacific. The landlocked countries like Nepal and Bhutan can have easy access to the Bay of Bengal, which can help them achieve a higher economic growth rate. And if you talk about Myanmar and Thailand, it can access the ever-growing consumer markets of Southeast Asia and can counterbalance Beijing's inroads into the these markets. So it is now time for the members countries to look at how they can take this momentum forward to make BIMSTEC more effective, visible, and result-oriented, as well as draw synergies with other groupings and adjoining regions to hasten the process of integration for the benefit of 1.5 billion people in the region. If we talk about challenges, given these advantages, BIMSTEC had emerged with much promise towards sub-regional and inter-regional integration in South Asia in terms of bringing its South Asian members closer to each other, as well as bringing the region to Southeast Asia. But there remain some challenges, and to that end, to make BIMSTEC more effective for the benefit of the people, it needs to address these challenges. First is visibility of BIMSTEC, which needs to be enhanced in a region where already a few other regional cooperation like ASEAN, SAARC, SASCC are in place. A visible BIMSTEC is a prerequisite for effective functioning. Like SAARC, the progress of BIMSTEC has also continued at a snail pace. It took 17 years for the organization to come up with a permanent secretariat, and it has held just 4 summits in last 2 decades. As BIMSTEC has a ambitious program of focusing on 14 areas of cooperation, it should prioritize on some key areas such as connectivity, energy, trade and investment, counterterrorism, and people-to-people contact, and need to restore age-old road, rail, and coastal connectivity, which were disconnected in the past. It is really disappointing that they are yet to finally conclude the BIMSTEC Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated in 2004. The BIMSTEC countries need to expedite this FTA to boost intra-regional trade. In addition to various bilateral initiatives, BIMSTEC countries need to hasten sub-regional cooperation on the energy sector. On the question of terrorism, it must unite to defeat it in all its forms and manifestation. Poverty is a common enemy of the development of the region, and need unite efforts by all countries to eliminate it. The region has been bearing the heavy burden of nature's fury as well. Calamities such as landslide and floods have caused colossal loss. To face this need collective preparedness to prevent the prince of such calamity. Currently, the COVID-19 pandemic brings exceptional challenges to the world. There is greater realization for the need of reduced regional organizations like BIMSTEC. The BIMSTEC countries should not leave any stone unturned to utilize this platform in addressing the challenges of the past COVID-19 era. Finally, the institutional mechanism of BIMSTEC has to be strengthened. Charter is needed to give more clarity to the vision of the group. And at the same time, the newly established secretariat has to be strengthened, and it should be given some discretion to take decision in between the summits or meetings. Key achievements. BIMSTEC has made significant achievements in some area of cooperation like infrastructure and connectivity. There is some progress in enhancing infrastructure and connectivity like cross-border energy connectivity and connectivity through power grid and pipelines, digital connectivity by laying cross-border optical fiber, and people-to-people connectivity through encourages tourism and exchange of people and ideas. Next is trans-grid connectivity. The grid interconnection MOU signed in 2018 by member states it sought to create a broad framework for the parties to cooperate towards the implementation of grid interconnections for the trade in electricity with a view of promoting rational and optimal power transmission in the BIMSTEC region. This was a leap forward in energy cooperation. Another is free trade area. The implementation of free trade agreement helped the intra-BIMSTEC trade growth. It is crucial to stimulate trade and investment in the parties and attract outsiders to trade with the invest in BIMSTEC at a higher level. And next is BIMSTEC Energy Center. On 22 January 2011, the member states signed the Memorandum of Association for the establishment of the BIMSTEC Energy Center in Bangalore, India. However, the BIMSTEC Energy Center has not yet been operationalized. Next is suppression of terrorism and mutual legal assistance. The member states signed the BIMSTEC Convention on Cooperation in Combating International Terrorism, Transnational Organized Crime, and Illicit Drug Trafficking in 2009. And BIMSTEC has made considerable progress yet it needs to accomplish comprehensive approaches within the regions to combat against both the domestic as well as transnational terrorism and crime. Next is BIMSTEC Transport Infrastructure and Logistics Study, BTILS. This technical assistance project enhances intergeneral integration by increasing trade and travel among BIMSTEC countries through identification of the main transport and logistic constraints. The study will help the development of policies and strategies and address barriers to effective and efficient trade. BTILS was endorsed by all member countries and provided the basis for a pipeline or regional projects. Finally, conclusion, due to the convergence of the national interest of the member countries, there is greater endeavor for empowering BIMSTEC in order to enhance trade and connectivity in the region. BIMSTEC should emerge as an important collective power in the region. The Secretariat should work on reviving the initial enthusiasm and that drove the initiative by holding high-level meetings regularly. BIMSTEC should give high priority to the development of world-class infrastructure for improved regional trading in frameworks. As decided during the fourth BIMSTEC summit in Kathmandu, regional connectivity and poverty alleviation should be emphasized on more, especially in Bhutan, Nepal, and the northeastern state of India. It should mutually fight against COVID-19.
And with the right amount of specialized efforts from each of the members nations in overcoming the above mentioned challenges, BIMSTEC can easily exploit its vast potential to enhance trade and connectivity for the mutual benefit of all in the region. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for concluding before time. 3:50 we were supposed to conclude, but we are well ahead of our time. 3:50 was the time given in the program. So thank you so much for your fascinating paper, the title BIMSTEC, Hope for Increased Cooperation. BIMSTEC, as we all know, it came when SAARC failed to live up to its expectations. As we all know that SAARC failed because of a bilateral problem between India and Pakistan. And as this is the principle of all multilateral organizations, that bilateral issues can't be raised in the multilateral organizations. So all regional organizations, all intergovernmental organizations, particularly regional organizations like European Union, SAARC, ASEAN, etc. So no bilateral disputes can be raised in the multilateral forum. And in fact, for the formation of SAARC, this was one of the conditions that the bilateral issues will not be raised in the SAARC forum. So that is why the India-Pakistan related issues can't be discussed in the SAARC forum. And that is why more than SAARC, the sidelines of SAARC becomes more important. And whenever SAARC summit happens, it is the India-Pakistan sideline summit that becomes more important than the main SAARC summit. So alternative to SAARC, the BIMSTEC came into existence. And since in the BIMSTEC, they are like-minded parties, and so there is every prospect that they will cooperate with each other. And that is why she has appropriately titled it Hope for Increased Cooperation. So BIMSTEC is doing much better than the SAARC, and now it has emerged as one of the viable alternative to SAARC. And that is why in the first swearing-in ceremony, Prime Minister Modi has invited all the SAARC leaders. But since SAARC could not make much headway, so he realized that in the next swearing-in ceremony, he dumped SAARC countries, and instead of SAARC, he invited all the BIMSTEC leaders. And even the G20 outreach also, which happened in Goa, so the BIMSTEC countries were invited. So now India is promoting BIMSTEC in the place of SAARC. So we have this prospect that increased cooperation will help for the regional integration. As we all know, the regional integration is based on the functionalism. In functionalism, we try to cooperate on the technical issues, the economic issues, which is non-contentious, and here the cooperations are possible. And progress in the non-contentious issues paves the way for having cooperation in another field. Yeah. So that is the idea. We had this functionalism, and on that this European Union started, and European Union has succeeded. And in the same principle, the SAARC ASEAN was also founded, and in the same principle, the SAARC was also founded. But because of India-Pakistan bilateral differences, it could not make much headway. So thank you so much for making a fascinating presentation. I utilized this time because you concluded before 3:50 here. So now the next paper presenter is Disha Garg.
Yes.
Disha Garg, now I have noted down the name of the paper presenter. So thank you so much for Sris for your valuable cooperation. But Disha Garg, she is the PG student in AIS. So I think MIT Institute of International Studies, I think AIS stands for. So Noida. So she is a PG student there. So, and Disha Garg, the title of her presentation is exactly the same, the title of this technical session.
No, sir. My topic is quadrilateralism in Indo-Pacific.
But in the
that title.
but in the program, it is written Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific region. Yeah, Indo-Pacific region. Yeah. So probably, sorry, but this is the title given in the program. So I'm reading out from the program. So sorry, you correct your title and make presentation. Over to Disha Garg.
Okay, a very warm good afternoon to all. Thank you, Chair, for giving me this golden opportunity. My topic is quadrilateralism in Indo-Pacific region. Please allow me to share my screen, sir.
Please unmute yourself, Disha.
Sir, my screen is visible.
Yes, Disha, your screen is visible, beta, and as well as you are perfectly audible.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Indo-Pacific and Quad, two most strategic concepts of our times. Two different things, yet very interrelated. Origin, evolution, and implication of these two concepts have great impact on India's strategy and India's national security. Hello all again. I welcome you to Vijishu 2020 to discuss quadrilateralism in Indo-Pacific. So my question is, what is the definitional differences related to Indo-Pacific region? And is India a soft peddler in the region? This concept has a peculiar charm in minds of maritime analysts. This strategic system spanning to oceans and continent, creating opportunity to work together in field of security issue and shared capacity. Efforts are not limited to meeting interest, but also looking ways to generate alternatives to proposals that already exist. So there are different interpretation of the region. First is India's view. India's view of Indo-Pacific is essentially about finding ways to work with other partners in the region. India lays great emphasis on inclusiveness. PM Modi keynote speech at Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore highlighted conciliatory prism or conciliatory view of India, that this is about stakeholdership, not containment strategy or group to dominate any other country in the region. India is happy to work with China and other countries in the region if China abide by certain rules and principles. India did not clearly mention about these rules and principles, but yes, India wants China to abide by rules and principles so that China can be a responsible partner in the region. The next is US view. US view of Indo-Pacific through confrontation model, that is China being an aggressor and other states should work together to contain China. Third view of Indo-Pacific is ASEAN's pragmatic version, where China is important stakeholder in the region, and it also questions Western interpretation of the rules and order. So next is Japan. Japan's view was presented by Shinzo Abe in 2007 as confluence of two oceans. And he proposed the idea of Quad as to create opportunity to work together and share responsibility. Again, the Western-based understanding of the region stress on transparency, accountability, access to common freedom of navigation, etc. And this is all to contain China and calling out Chinese aggression. But ASEAN doesn't want to work on that route. I find there is a similarity between India's view and ASEAN view to the extent where they both want to create space for China, but there is a hidden strategy, or you can say a trump card for Quad. If China doesn't follow rules and norms in the region or directly threaten India's national interest in the region, um, Americans have black and white understanding of the rules-based order, but Chinese don't openly discuss it. India and US don't agree on certain things. That is a deficit we can have when it comes to Quad. So for US, it is a strategy to contain China. For Japan and Australia, it is a policy, and for India, it is a vision to bring all the sides together for cooperation, for shared responsibility. And I find that this vision also highlighted Act East policy and create incentives for India to do more with specific partners. Uh, Quad in Indo-Pacific. Uh, Quad is an informal strategic dialogue between four big democracies: US, India, Australia, and Japan in Indo-Pacific region. As of now, not seen as a grouping that wants to challenge any country, or but essential rational setting of Quad has to do with balancing China and Russia in the region. The Quad concept is about Asia Pacific plus India, with the aim to draw India in the dimension. So it is a trump card for India, and it is a new concept to broader Asia, which ensure transparent networks for goods, knowledge, capital, rule-based order. So I found that Quad is more of like economic tie-ups, or like soft. It promotes soft power in the region. Or pretend to promote soft power in region. China's view on Quad is uh, like first, strategic community has branded Quad as emerging Asian NATO. It is a China's view. There is a general understanding that Quad would not take military dimension against any country. But China still believes that Quad lays foundation for military alliance against it, with aim to oppose China's ambitious project BRI. China carries the idea of Asia Pacific, while the idea of Quad is Indo-Pacific. Quad in post. I would like to conclude my presentation like Quad in post-COVID era. So I see the increasing significance of Quad in post-COVID era. Um, like after assuming office, PM of Japan, Saga has spoken to US President Donald Trump, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, German Chancellor, British Prime Minister. So the next quadrilateral security dialogue is going to organize in Tokyo. Japan PM wants to signal the priority he accorded in grouping, to promote cooperation in multilateral mechanism to advance free trade, inclusive Indo-Pacific region, pluralism, regional stability in the post-pandemic recovery efforts. So Japan's position is very clear. We can see that Japan is, as of now, is very serious about this quadrilateral dialogue and engaging other partners too. Now the Japan and India special strategic Japan and India special strategic partnership and global partnership is taking another level, new level, with their tie-ups in 5G technology to create digital technology, high-speed trains, and 5G, creating 5G infrastructure and all. So like we are discussing new things. We are moving ahead in this quadrilateral dialogue. I can see how China is also giving strength to Quad as countries are reacting to increased bullying by China. This grouping gained greater fraction when since early 2020 because Beijing's role in COVID-19 and attempt to hijack other multilateral institutions like WHO and International Civil Aviation Organization, and the concern over global supply chain and dependency on China. Thank you.
Okay. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
You're audible.
So we are well within time. So we are 20 minutes ahead of the time. And since we are 20 minutes ahead of the time, so I'll be using this opportunity of making chair remarks.
Yes, sir.
So this is what this Garg spoke on quadrilateralism and India-Pacific region here. This quadrilateralism, as he said, in fact, this lateralism, unilateralism, bilateralism, multilateralism, quadrilateralism, all these refers to the process of decision making. If any country without consulting any other country of the international community takes the decision on its own and imposes on others, then this is the case of unilateralism. So all the global hegemon, they prefer unilateralism rather than bilateralism, multilateralism, or quadrilateralism. So it was said that after the end of Cold War, when the unipolar world came into existence and United States emerged as the undisputed global hegemon, so United States of America was accused of practicing unilateralism and exceptionalism and triumphalism in its foreign policy. So this America used to take the decision without consulting anyone, even its own close allies. So this case, this example of decision making in the international system without consulting others is called unilateralism, and America is accused of practicing unilateralism. Bilateralism, as it is obvious from the term, that two countries consult each other and then they take the decision, and many countries take the conscious decision to keep their disputes as bilateral, as it is being practiced by India with Pakistan. And bilateralism was one of the principles of the Simla Agreement, which was signed after the Bangladesh war, liberation of Bangladesh. And then Pakistan agreed that all the bilateral disputes with India, like Kashmir and others, will be resolved bilaterally, and international community and other countries, third countries, have no role in it. So this is the example of bilateralism. So many countries prefer bilateralism. And then multilateralism. So multilateralism is the process of decision making in all the regional organizations, multilateral organizations. So this is, and the quadrilateral lateralism is also part of multilateralism. So this Disha Garg, who spoke extensively on this quadrilateralism, this idea in fact came from the Western world, and still it is at the consultation level, and it is still confined, downgraded to the official level. Even it has not been raised to the ministerial level, though there is a demand from various quarters that it should be raised to the ministerial level. But since many countries, including India, they are sensitive to the Chinese concerns, so because of the Chinese sensitivities, India itself was not interested in raising its level from official level to ministerial level and to the highest level. And even Australia was also not very interested, and the previous government, which was more pro-Chinese, not this Dennis Morrison government. When Kevin Rudd was the Australian Prime Minister, he was more pro-Chinese. So even he was also not interested in promoting this quadrilateral initiative. But now, since the Chinese threat has risen and China is asserting itself and it's poking its nose everywhere, flexing its muscles. So now the rise of China is posing threat to all the countries who are involved in this quadrilateral initiative. China is a threat to Japan, threat to India, and various strategic policies since 2001. Repeatedly, United States America has been saying that that China is the strategic competitor of the United States of America. So America was interested in promoting this quadrilateral initiative, but because of this Chinese objection, Chinese sensitivity, and India, Australia, and even including Japan, they were also very sensitive to the Chinese concerns because of the economic and commercial reasons and many other reasons. And most importantly, because the previous government, Hu Jintao government, was not so aggressive as the Xi Jinping government is there, because they were adhering to the Deng Xiaoping's policy of concealing the capability and hiding the capability and bidding for the opportune time. So they were pursuing that policy and they were not flexing their muscles. But since things have changed since 2013, when Xi Jinping has come to power, So now all those countries were involved in this quadrilateral initiative, all the 4 countries here, because of the increasing Chinese aggressive behavior, aggressive posture. They have been forced to revive this quadrilateral initiative. The idea of quadrilateral initiative was always there. And Malabar exercises is one of the examples there. And there was one Malabar exercise, it was conducted, I think probably 2007. Exact year, I don't know, but when this Japan, Singapore, India, United States of America, they have participated here. But since China objected, and because of Chinese objection, India downgraded it to the bilateral level. So now this Malabar exercises has been upgraded to trilateral military exercises. Now India, United States of America, and Japan, these 3 are conducting Malabar naval exercises. And Australia is also keen to join it. And if Australia is also included, then this quadrilateral initiative, which is at the consultation level, this will be in actual, it will form an actual shape, concrete shape in the form of Malabar exercises. And the objective of Malabar exercises is to increase the interoperability of these 4 forces, so that Indian Navy, Australian Navy, Japanese Navy, and American Navy can jointly operate together, fighting against a common enemy. So now that Disha rightly said that it is the future Asian NATO. It is emerging. It is still at the consultation level, but I hope that in future it will acquire a concrete shape and will be from official level. It will be raised to the higher level. So this is all about this multilateralism, and this quadrilateralism is part of multilateralism, and probably these 4 countries. And if you see the Chinese defense expenditure, if you exclude United States of America, you put all the countries of Indo-Pacific on the one side, their defense spending on the one side, that comes around $217 billion per annum. And you see this this Chinese defense expenditure, it is $228 billion. This figure is of 2017. Means the China is spending $10 billion more than all the Indo-Pacific countries put together, minus United States of America. So with this kind of huge defense expenditure, the Chinese strategic profile is increasing day by day in this region. And that is why these countries have been left with no option but to go for internal balancing and external balancing. By internal balancing, I mean every country is involved in increasing its own capabilities. So by raising their own capability, they are doing the internal balancing, and by bringing the other like-minded partners like Australia, Japan, America in case of India. So by bringing in the external partner, they are also involved in external balancing. So by external balancing and internal balancing, they are trying to deal with this rising Chinese menace. So that is the reason behind this quadrilateral initiative, which is day by day increasing its profile. So, okay, then I took this time because we have 20 minutes extra. So otherwise a chair usually don't speak so much. So just I'm simply filling up the gap because the time which has been given to me because of my good presenters, because they're not taking much time quickly finishing their presentation. So now the next paper presenter is Mr. Gaurav Misra. His paper is on, his title is Border Dispute in South Asia. And Gaurav Misra is the ICSR Doctoral Fellow. So now over to Gaurav Misra.
Sir, actually, Mr. Gaurav Misra has not submitted the first draft of full paper. Also, he has not submitted any PPT. And lately, he is just out of contact. So I think we are not having him for the presentation, sir.
So, okay, if that is the case, then the last presenter is Anushka Saxena.
Yes.
and she is a PG student, Lady Sri College, very prestigious college of Delhi. And her paper is on ASEAN. So over to Anushka Saxena. And Anushka, you have enough time because Gaurav has opted out. So you can take his time also. Over to Anushka Saxena.
Firstly, I hope I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are visible and you are audible also.
Thank you for the opportunity. My warm greetings and welcome to the esteemed chair. Thank you, sir. I thank AISS, Dr. Pathak, Pramod, sir, and most importantly to our viewers and listeners. Now, since we're running ahead of time, I will take the opportunity to go a minute or two ahead of what has been allotted to me. But I'll try to put forth my points in the most comprehensive manner possible. The topic that I'm going to be talking about, the paper that I'm presenting today, is there's no PPT, so you'll have to bear with me. But the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific Narrative, Prospects for Regional Hegemony. Now, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has been through a lot ever since its inception. When the ASEAN was formed in 1967, it aimed to create a cohesive group of non-communist nations who were willing to counter China's increasing interests in communism in Southeast Asia. And they were seeking regional political and economic support in a post-colonial setup. Today, the ASEAN sits at the center of one of the world's most geostrategically vital regions, that is the Indo-Pacific. Now, for a long time, the term Asia-Pacific was used to describe the region encompassing the Asia that lied in the Western Pacific Ocean, including East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and Oceania. However, the term Indo-Pacific was coined later to define a priority towards the Indian Ocean region and to show a little more inclusivity towards India and its surrounding seas. Now, the Indo-Pacific can be understood as a framework for maritime cooperation, marked by the presence of ASEAN at the geographical center and stretching up to the ends of the maritime routes that connect this center with India, Africa, Australia, West Asia, that is Iran, Syria, and Northeast Asia, which is North Korea. The Indo-Pacific strategy sits at the underbelly of ASEAN's maritime power, and it serves as the next big thing that will drive the attention of the world away from the transatlantic and project it towards the rising giant that is Asia. Historically, we know that the center of geopolitical power in the world has shifted. In the earliest times, it was concentrated in the Middle East and Africa. Then we see with the emergence of America, with the emergence of Europe and America, it shifts there, which is the transatlantic. And today we see it shifting towards Asia. But the region comes with its contentions. With China's rising maritime aggression, as has been very well pointed out by some of the speakers before me, and its long-term ambition of becoming number one, as well as the emergence of a power almost rivaling the ASEAN, which is called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, there is a significant uncertainty as to what the Indo-Pacific means for the region and the world, and who gets to be the leader in the Indo-Pacific narrative. This brings me to talk about the many players of this game. So the Indo-Pacific is home to 60% of the world's transit trade, making it a strategic hub and a central location for maritime connectivity. So the Strait of Malacca, for example, which is one of the world's most important choke points for maritime trade, lies here. It also houses the vision for an Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor, or IPEC, one that aims to create a transnational trade network connecting South and Southeast Asian nations among themselves and with the rest of the world. Many of the nations in this region can be found as being allies to the APEC, or the Asia Pacific Economic Corridor, as well as the very ambitious and the infamous China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. At the same time, the region faces volatilities due to operation of pirates on the seas, which makes them a non-state actor, the fear of massive interference from the US and China, which makes them a third party in the region, and the general lack of dynamic leadership which has been the case mostly because of conflicting Indo-Pacific strategies and visions from the three most important players in the region: China, US, and ASEAN, and the various alliances that they bring with themselves. So in 2016, the former Japanese President Shinzo Abe first talked about free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which has come to be an important part of the US, the Quad's approach to the region. The Quad, which comprises of US, Japan, Australia, and India, follows this somewhat cohesive strategy of creating an Indo-Pacific that is free and open for the partners and is modeled on good regional governance and freedom of navigation. So the free and open Indo-Pacific has emerged as somewhat of a counter argument to ASEAN's open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, which is a strategy that the association has been working upon since January of 2018. The inclusivity that the ASEAN talks about here and the US opposes refers to China's inclusion in the region. Now, it must be noted that ASEAN's engagements with China have been on the rise ever since the two became signatories to an FTA or a free trade agreement in 2002, owing to the failed efforts of some ASEAN nations in being able to follow an FTA among themselves, and their increasing dependence on China for infrastructural, trade, and economic support has led them to become much closer to China than they would like. At the same time, China's increasing presence in Southeast Asia, either through the BRI or through its maritime aggressiveness, as evident in its string of pearls strategy or in its bullying mechanisms in the disputed South China Sea, threatens stability in the region. Vietnam has complained about this time and again, especially in context of the Paris Islands Spratly, which are islands that are claimed by both China and Vietnam. And despite being the chair of ASEAN in previous years, Vietnam was unable to unite ASEAN member states against China in the South China Sea. So the ASEAN faces a similar dilemma in dealing with the United States, primarily because the US-ASEAN economic ties are on the rise, and again the individual member state priority overcomes the priority that they give to the multilateral entity. And the US, on one hand, there are some nations in ASEAN, such as Thailand and the Philippines, who have certain strong relations with China, which is a bone of contention for the US. And on the other hand, there are nations like Singapore that lie on the other side. So the balance game that ASEAN member states are attempting to play, both with China and the US, is a major causative factor for why the global fate of Indo-Pacific narrative is yet to be determined. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was released as a strategy document in 2019, defined the efforts of ASEAN in making or in creating an Indo-Pacific based on values of mutual trust, openness, inclusivity, transparency, good governance, respect for sovereignty, rule of law, and most importantly, non-intervention. However, there is no direct mention of China or US in the document. At the same time, it agrees to freedom of navigation that the US emphasizes on as well. However, there is no mention of any military or defense strategy that the ASEAN will be collectively undertaking to deal with the threats in the Indo-Pacific. Nor does it talk about the tensions created by US-China adversity in the region, nor does it talk about the nuclear ambitions of North Korea or the internal factors within the ASEAN that may act as obstacles to the success of this strategy. The fact that this outlook was charted by the undertaking of the drafting and charting of this strategy was by Indonesia, which is also a member state, and it's a member state known to be the representative mediating party of ASEAN. It may work well in emancipating Indonesia's image with China or the US, especially since the country wished to generate an outlook that neither challenged the US FOIP or China's BRI. And this effort may also reiterate the idea that the role both the Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN play in Jakarta's foreign policy is less important than its own image. Discussing the strategy document brings me to a deeper analysis and a comparative analysis of ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook. So the document, which was released in 2019, it's comprehensive and it states that the vision of ASEAN as defined in the document is not to replace a pre-existing mechanism or to provide a new one, but to envisage an Indo-Pacific where ASEAN is central to regional architecture. Now, the emphasis on ASEAN's centrality towards development of Indo-Pacific infrastructure it's being observed for a number of years now, especially in its promotional strategies towards the East Asia Summit, which is a dialogue held among 18 states parties from Asia Pacific on matters pertaining to regional dynamics. We see that in the first East Asia Summit, which was held in Malaysia in 2005, it led to the formulation of a Kunming Declaration, essentially focused on development of communication and transport networks, as well as other forms of infrastructure, with the backing of the ASEAN. So it gives us a clear idea as to how ASEAN envisions itself, as well as how it envisions ASEAN-led mechanisms in the region, including EAS, including ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, or ASEAN Regional Forum. Another important aspect of this outlook focuses on intervention and at the same time amicable cooperation. Now the South China Sea aspect figures very vividly here. So allow me to cite an example for you. In 2013, Philippines, which is a member state of ASEAN, filed a case against People's Republic of China in the Public Court of Arbitration, or PCA, stating that China's 9-line map has no historical relevance, and therefore China's claims on it become a matter of exploiting Philippine sovereignty. Since Philippines is a claimant to these islands that are closest to its own mainland, but China's 9-map depictions showed otherwise. In this context, the Declaration of Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which was signed between China and ASEAN in November 2002, this code stated that any differences that emerge in the South China Sea should be resolved using bilateral dialogue mechanisms. But with Philippines violating the code by filing a case with the PCA, it led to severe deterioration of China-Philippines relations, and they were revived only when Robert Duterte came to power in Philippines. Similar sentiments can be observed in Vietnam, which is also an ASEAN member, wherein the country is seen strengthening security and infrastructure relations with the US to counter China in the South China Sea, something that also violates the 2002 code, simply because it brings a third party into a bilateral dispute. So the perspective on cooperation and negotiation that is so emphasized in the ASEAN outlook faces challenges at the member state level itself. On the other hand, it wouldn't also be unfair to call China an external threat to the harmony that this document promotes, considering the fact that the country has repeatedly violated another document, which is called the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which was created by ASEAN, and it was ratified by China as a non-ASEAN member in 2003. And it violates this by continuing hostilities in the South China Sea. If I come to a more comparative analysis, the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, though it's resonating with some of the political ideals of ASEAN's outlook, such as country sovereign rights and rule of law, the larger part of it is security and counterterrorism oriented. So the 2019 US free and open Indo-Pacific document claims to work side by side with the sovereign states in the Indo-Pacific through its strategic military and security influence. As can be seen in the case of Australia, Japan, or Vietnam. These countries are in dynamic defense partnerships with the US, and they make sure that US military presence is felt in the region. In this context, the China factor figures again. We see US aircraft and naval sorties in the South China and the Philippine Sea regions almost every day. US sorties with large reconnaissance aircrafts, bomber aircrafts, warships, and Navy passengers a common affair in the sea. While some may say it is indicative of the US exercising freedom of navigation, the counter-China symbolism is very apparent here. And on the other hand, unlike the US FOIP strategy, which not only emphasizes on infrastructural development and maritime trade, but also upon countering transnational crime, restricting activities of miscreant non-state actors like pirates, establishing networks to counter cybercrime and use of internet for terrorism, promoting nuclear non-proliferation, and cooperating in provisions like naval bases, aircrafts, dual-use carriers, and alternative energy sources. this extensive detailing of US-ASEAN partnership in these aspects is merely stated by the ASEAN Outlook in a list of possible areas of cooperation. And so how the FOIP strategy overwhelms the ASEAN strategy is not only in this aspect, but also in US's funding. For example, the US Department of State is through its Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative and the Bay of Bengal Initiative is giving funds of US $356 million, or even in the form of foreign assistance provided to the region by US Agency for International Development, which came to a total in 2019 to about US $4.5 billion. And this overwhelms ASEAN's mere call for cooperation, primarily because the economic and political stature that the United States has managed to create for itself, especially with certain individual Indo-Pacific and ASEAN states, cannot be rivaled. Now, while the ASEAN Outlook clearly states it means no harm to another outlook, its emphasis on ASEAN centrality can hardly bear fruit with the presence of US on one side and China on the other. So in this context, reforms in the outlook must look at not just diversifying cooperation among Indo-Pacific states, but also intra-ASEAN cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. To prioritize this outlook, ASEAN states must exchange among themselves things that they are now borrowing from other countries. The states need to be assured that their stringent alliance with the ASEAN will fulfill not just their purpose in the region, but their national economic and military demands as well, which is the primary, and the lack of fulfillment of the latter is the primary reason why they choose to drop their alliance with ASEAN and instead form deeper bilateral relations with countries like China and US. In this context, it is also important for the ASEAN Outlook to provide frameworks for governance of piracy, transnational criminality, and cybercrime in the region, so as to emerge central to the security dynamics of the region. And in this regard, naval interoperability, logistical support agreements, intelligence and surveillance networks, and exchange of military personnel for training will be important steps. What is also important is climate change cooperation. It is well understood that smaller littoral states of the Indo-Pacific, such as Fiji, Seychelles, Micronesia, Mauritius, or East Timor, face unprecedented sinking conditions at the hands of global warming and melting glaciers. So for example, the Fijian Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama has begun planning to shift 40 Fijian villages to a greater height amidst rising sea levels in the Indo-Pacific, which threaten Fiji to sink. In this context, what ASEAN can do is set up mechanisms to provide shelter to refugees of climate change, and can facilitate ASEAN-led rapid response, or HADR, which is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief mechanisms for hostilities inflicted by natural calamities or climate change. This would also further ASEAN's image and its defense and security status in the region. In this regard, the ASEAN in its Indo-Pacific outlook must also attempt to act as the upholder of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Its capacity to uphold norms that are levied by this convention on commercial and warships in the South China Sea through political or legal action may further its image as a rightful hegemon in the sea. There are many articles in the UNCLOS that the ASEAN can use, and there are various aspects of that convention that the ASEAN can well use to enhance its own geopolitical agenda. Concludingly, the ASEAN as a forum, what I feel is that the ASEAN as a forum is yet to decide what it exactly is. So there are one of the four questions to answer here. Is it an economic cooperative among Southeast Asian nations aiming to create a mutual economic boom and reduce inequalities? Does it wish to emerge as a hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, having countered the shenanigans of China and the US? Does it wish to act as the center of trade and maritime connectivity for the world? Or is it a legal, social, and political order for Southeast Asian nations, and that attempts to resolve disputes and take necessary action against threats to the region? In my opinion, the ASEAN is yet to define the priority of its existence despite its achievements. The mandate and the limited funding of the grouping will make it difficult for the entity to progress beyond its current scope, and its understaffed secretariat bears a major burden. The 10 nations that the ASEAN comprises of represent a diverse spectrum of identities and political affiliations in the forum. The economic and military capacities of these member nations also stand at a major disparity. So while Singapore remains one of the world's most developed free markets, Cambodia remains one of the poorest countries in the world. Poverty, inequality, lack of focus on sustainable development continue to ail ASEAN member countries. The inability of ASEAN in being able to bring about consent of all members in policy making and in taking action on issues that concern the region in this light will be seen as can be seen as a consequence of these intra-ASEAN disparities, and therefore they are counterproductive to ASEAN's growth and its fulfillment of its Indo-Pacific strategy. So suggestively, the first step ASEAN must take is to diversify sources of its funding, because clearly national contributions shall not be enough to both reform and rigorously implement its Indo-Pacific outlook. Secondly, the need to increase staffing of the ASEAN body, which is the Secretariat, with experts from diverse fields, which may include economists, security specialists, cyber specialists, climate experts, and logistical staff. This need stems from another need for ASEAN to progress in its agenda. Thirdly, the ASEAN must develop a framework to enable a European Union style customs union and promote the idea of a single market in the forum, so that the economic and commercial growth of one member state leads to direct growth for the other. This can be done through establishment of special economic zones or SEZs in the Indo-Pacific, through multilateral free trade agreements, or by the establishment of a maritime economy initiative similar to the Indian Ocean Rim Association or the IORA. Lastly, to further cooperation with small states, the ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook must robustly encourage and support for small states to adopt a blue economy model of governance and legislature that prioritizes preservation of their marine resources on the basis of an ecosystem-based management of resources. Finally, the ability of the ASEAN to deal with its internal conflicts and to reach a consensus among member nations on how to deal with the hindrances in its Indo-Pacific strategy is yet to be determined. The biannual ASEAN summit that was held in Thailand in November 2019 and the consequent joint statement released by ASEAN in March 2020 proved fruitful in charting a collective strategy on how ASEAN would deal with COVID-19 in the region. In the context of Indo-Pacific also, the ASEAN must adopt a similar approach of discussion, debate, accommodation of dissent, and rigorous implementation of the blueprint that emerges forthwith. Amid the current COVID-19 pandemic, the need for increased regional international cooperation has been realized and observed, and ASEAN has the potential to emerge as the epitome or as the exemplary power for this cooperation that is needed. So the final point here is that this potential can only be achieved through collective action in the grouping on dealing with China and the US, on reforming its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and through the creation of a joint action plan that addresses the economic inequalities in the region and attempts to resolve them through cooperation restricted among ASEAN members itself. That said, thank you once again for your patient listening, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anushka, for a very elaborate presentation. So, ASEAN outlook on the India-Pacific, and probably you touched everything: COVID, economic cooperation, strategic cooperation, the conflict, everything. So it was a very vast presentation. So you touched almost everything. Yeah. So you see this. You referred to European Union. The certain things ASEAN should learn from European Union. In fact, it was the earlier case. Now European Union must learn from ASEAN rather than ASEAN should learn from European Union, because the European Union is facing deep crisis with the Brexit and many other countries threatening to quit the European Union. and with the nationalism is rising everywhere. And in almost all the European Union countries, members, there is a demand for quitting the European Union. So European Union is facing the tough time, but that is not case with the ASEAN. So rather than ASEAN learning from European Union must learn from ASEAN. It's other way around. ASEAN, as we all know, it was created to fight the menace of communism, and it was mainly directed against the Soviet Union and the communist China. But now this communism threat has become the thing of the past. And now China is an active player, important player in this region. And this rising China and declining America has created various kind of uncertainties among the ASEAN nations. So you find that all these 10 ASEAN nations, they are in different groups. Some of them, there are 3 choices available to them. One is bandwagoning, another is balancing, and third is neutrality. So these 10 different countries, out of these 3 choices, the countries like Cambodia, Laos, etc., they have adopted this bandwagoning strategy to deal with China. And there was a ASEAN conference in Cambodia, and it is because of China factor, because no communique could be released because there was some objection by the host on the inclusion of some critical sentences to China. So now China is an important factor over there, and countries like Cambodia, Laos, etc. And even Philippines also, who was with the United States of America. The current regime of Duterte, now they have also adopted a different kind of bandwagoning with the China. So bandwagoning is one strategy. And then there are many other countries of ASEAN who are pro-United States of America, and United States of America has been net security provider to the ASEAN countries and the wider region of Indo-Pacific. So many countries like Singapore, Thailand, etc., they usually adopt pro-US policy there. And then there are countries like Indonesia and etc. They maintain strict neutrality, and they don't get involved in this Sino-US geostrategic rivalry. So these 3 things are there. So, and economically, it has been successful. Economic cooperation has been successful, and many countries joined. Even RCEP, India was also part of it. And RCEP was mainly ASEAN-centric negotiation. India has opted out of it. So ASEAN has emerged as a very important thing in this Indo-Pacific. In fact, it occupies the center of the Indo-Pacific. So very fascinating, interesting presentation, Anushka. So now floor is open for the questions. Firstly, some questions are there in the chat box. So I'm reading out the questions one by one, and then I will request the paper presenters to reply those questions. I'm reading the questions from the chat box here. So. So first question, the Sumitra Karki, can you listen me?
Yes, sir.
Sumitra.
Yes, sir.
So this question to you, I'm reading out the question from the chat box.
Okay.
As both BIMSTEC and SAARC connect Southeast nations, but what differences make the both unique in their own way, and which one has been successful over the years? So, did you get the question, or I should read it again?
No, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for the questions.
Yeah.
I think there is not much difference between the two, as both organizations have not made great achievements in past years. However, the SAARC got stopped due to India-Pakistan rivalry, and this is not a case in BIMSTEC, so it might flourish. BIMSTEC also provide opportunity to connectivity between South and Southeast nations, Southeast Asia. So there is a high chance of BIMSTEC bringing economic gains for member countries instead, with compared to SAARC.
Okay, this second question, this is to Gargi Sharma. Gargi, are you hearing me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Gargi, the question to you is, what consequences will China face from the nations from Indo-Pacific region for its aggression? And is China prepared for it? Is question clear, or should I
Yes,
read
sir.
it again?
No, sir. It's clear.
Yeah.
I think, sir, China was already doing well in terms of trade, so it should focus more on economic progression rather than being violent with its neighbors and partners and other countries. Otherwise, it will be isolated. If it keeps going the same way, it will lead to its neighbors and trade partners leaving its side. They can form some sort of anti-China organization, some sort of military organization to counter China, to contain its growth, which may have a negative impact on its growth. Right now, it does not matter to China. We have seen what it did to Australia when it asked for an investigation in the origin of the virus. So most of the countries are so economically dependent on it that it can threaten them economically. Not sure if China is prepared for the lashback and if it will affect it in the short term, but yes, in the long term, a collective action against any country, no matter how strong it is, it can completely turn the tables. So I think it should refrain from doing whatever it is doing right now, or it can be difficult for it in the future.
Okay. Now that's all. There is one more question, and this question is to the chair. So chair will reply it later on. And there is one more in the context of re-emerging age of Asia, which would require increased cooperation among Asian nations like India, China, Japan, and ASEAN nations. What impact will China's continuous aggression and unilateral decisions in the Indo-Pacific region have on the prospects of collaborations and cooperation among these Asian nations in the future? So this question has not been addressed to any particular paper presenter, so anyone can reply this question.
If nobody minds, I can address it.
Yeah.
Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. So, see, in the context of China's role in the cooperation among Asian nations and the ASEAN, the most important aspect that figures is the Belt and Road Initiative in the context of a post-pandemic world. Also, China's political tensions with India, and what mechanisms or what countries does India refer to be able to counter China's economic and political hegemony?
Yes, Anushka, just a minute. Be brief in your answer because my battery is dying. So, so that I can conclude the sessions. Otherwise, in between, I will not be available. Yeah. So, be brief in your answer. Yeah. Okay. So that I can conclude before my battery is dying. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'll just make 2 points here. One that I talked about is BRI, and one that I talked about is India-China relations. So now countries have to understand that with the economic effects that they are dealing with because of the COVID-19 pandemic, do they wish to still keep investing in BRI? Do they still wish to be part of the debt trap diplomacy that China has so well established in the region, which is also this debt trap is also the reason why certain countries choose to drop their alliance with other nations or multilateral institutions and keep in touch with China, keep in the and be in the good books of China, because in most cases they are unable to repay back their loans, and that is when the debt trap acts, and China, seizes an opportunity to take control of certain asset or something else, or in some cases take control of the entire political system. I won't name the nation here, but it's very close to India. So the context of BRI figures, the debt trap diplomacy figures, and the second context is India-China relations. So if India and China are able to find a mode or mechanism to coexist harmoniously, then the region has no way to go but prosper. But in the context that India chooses to include US as a third party and ingrain it in its own politics, then the region is in grave danger because China cannot tolerate presence of US in the region, which is being increasingly seen as something that that India is adopting in its approach to dealing with China. How much can economic partnership of India-China lead to betterment of India-China relations politically? This is yet to be seen. So I think these are two factors that need to be focused on, and the success of either or both of them will lead the region further. So thank you.
Okay, then this is the last question, and this question has been addressed to me by Sukriti Atre. So the question I'm reading out, you mentioned that Pakistan is the region of regional organizations such as BIMSTEC and SAARC not being able to achieve its objective. Would that be the only major reason to state the decreasing credibility of these organizations? And this question is to me. Yes, Pakistan has been one factor for regionalism not being successful in this South Asian region, but definitely Pakistan is not the only factor. In fact, India's size is such a problem for any regional organizations, because all the countries, whether it is BIMSTEC, whether it is BBIN, whether it is any regional groupings, India's large positions, large population, etc., makes other smaller countries they are scared of India's size, etc. And this is another reason for regionalism not being successful in this region. If you look at the European Union and ASEAN, you will find that most of the members of the ASEAN and European Union are roughly of the same size. There is no one country in European Union and ASEAN who occupies such a large predominant position which India occupies in South Asia. So this is another reason, as S.D. Muni sir said in the morning, that because of this reason, all the smaller nations are scared of their own separate and distinct identity and their own sovereignty, etc. So this is also another reason for this failure of regionalism in South Asian region. Yeah. So with this, we are coming to an end. I have made comment on all the papers except the one very brief comment I will make on Gargi Sharma's paper, the Chinese aggression and the Indian Pacific region. Here, you see the China, there is a concept in international relations, the Thucydides trap. So this Thucydide trap is used in the context of the conflict between the rising power and the established power. The rising power is also called the revisionist power, and the established power are also called the status quoist power or conservative power. So in the present context, the China is the rising power, is the revisionist power, and United States of America is the status quoist power, the established power. Yeah. So China is the ruling power, and this ruling power is being challenged by rising power China. And the realism says, and particularly the offensive realism of John Mersenne and others, says that whenever there is a rising power in any international system, so it created instability and chaos in the international order. So, and all the rise of power has been followed by war, whether it is the rise of Germany during the Hitler's time, it led to the Second World War, rise of Germany during Kaiser-William's time, it led to the First World War, rise of Napoleonic France led to the war in Europe. So all the war, all the rising power has led to the instability and war. So if the same thesis is applied to rise of China, so rise of China will also lead to the war. And this Thucydides, when he writes about the Peloponnesian War, the 30 years war which happened in Greece. So it was the rise of Athens. The rise of Athens created a situation where the established power Sparta was left with no option but to wage a war against the rising Athens. So rising Athenian power led to the war between Athens and Sparta. So this Thucydide traps is being said that rising China will be challenged by the established power America, and it will eventually lead to the war. And this thesis of the peaceful rise of China, and China avoided to use the word rise. China uses the word peaceful development of China. So whether use the peaceful development China or rise of China, it also might lead to the war if you go by the thesis of Thucydides or by the thesis of the realist thinker, particularly the structural realist, the offensive realist, the John Mersheimer, etc. So, so war is a possibility, the chaos is the possibility. Whether when this now the international order has changed, this order is not that kind of Cold War order or the previous order. Now in this globalized world, the kind of engagement all the great powers are having with each other, the trade and commerce have bound them together. So because of this economic and commercial engagement, which is reducing the possibilities of war. So now we are passing through a very difficult situation, whether international liberalism, whether the complex interdependence will prevent the war, or as John Mersheimer says, or many people who subscribe to the Thucydides trap theory, it will lead to the war between United States of America on the one side and China on the other side. And the other countries of the region, the Indo-Pacific region, if war happens between the United States of America and China, definitely the battleground will be the Indo-Pacific here. So, and all countries will be affected. Yeah. So this has created a kind of uncertainty in this region, and all the countries of this region have to take the conscious decision so that they can maximize their national interest and minimize the possibility of war, which will be the interest of all the countries, because any nuclear weapon power are there. China is one, North Korea is another, India is another, Pakistan is another, four these Asian powers, and then America can also be treated as a resident power of Asia and also nuclear power. So these nuclear powers are there, they are also equipped with missiles, sophisticated weapons, etc. And if any war breaks out in this region, it will not be confined to the land, sea and air. It will go to the space also, because all these countries are also preparing for the space war. So it will be the disastrous for the international community, for the whole region. So now this is a challenge to the entire region, to all countries of this region, how to prevent the war and how to maintain the peace in this region. And that is the objective of Indo-Pacific. The peaceful and independent Indo-Pacific is the objective. So hope wide sense will prevail, and these countries through their collective decision making will prevent the war, will prevent the tension, will prevent the conflict. They will resolve their bilateral, multilateral disputes, which are many, of such a policy which will be mutually beneficial to all. With this, I'm concluding this session. Now over to Sri Pathak to make the final announcement regarding this webinar. Over to Sri Pathak.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a lecture come chair session, sir. Actually, we have learned a lot, and always I was just talking to my colleagues that always a pleasure to listen to you, sir. And the way it has just gone out, it's really very much impressive, sir. And we have learned a lot, sir. Thank you so much, sir. One question we are having, sir, in the chat box. I think Vashundhara has put that questions coming from Rohit to Anushka. Can we take that, sir, that question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Please,
So, sir, I'm reading out that question to Anushka.
So one thing, Sri.
Yes.
In case I'm getting disconnected, then think that my battery has died.
Okay, so sir,
So before, excuse me,
yes, ma'am.
so before the battery goes down, let me thank you formally for this excellent session. Even in between, if the battery goes on, I'll not feel good because if I don't talk to you, then it will not be correct, right? So before your battery goes down, let me thank you wholeheartedly. It was excellent session. You had really given the lecture, plus you have chaired the session very brilliantly. And this is how our students and we as a faculty also, we have learned a lot. Thank you so much, sir. So
Most
over
welcome,
to,
most welcome, ma'am.
over
Yeah,
to
most
Dr.
welcome.
Shirish for the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir. So to Anushka, I'm again repeating that question. The question. So I'm just reading out the question to you, Anushka. If Indochina decides to be harmonious, then region will prosper unless and until India bring USA in fold. What will being harmonious mean in that situation if you can't do anything opposes China? Isn't that the same situation as before? Why the Quad failed? Are you getting the sense from this question, Anushka?
Yes, so firstly, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. Sir, whatever I'm unable to, whatever I'm able to understand the question, I try and address it accordingly.
Yes.
It's slightly unfair to say that the Quad failed because of China. It is true that Australia's hesitance in upsetting China led for the Quad to fall apart in 2007 and 8. But today, China has tensed everybody so much that they are actually seeing Quad as a counter to China's prevalence. So the relevance of India-China bilateral negotiations figures very importantly in this context because India has the power to balance contrasting foreign policies. In this case, US and China. Harmonious doesn't stay put and does nothing to oppose China. What it means is that you have the capacity to harmoniously balance what the US is saying and what China is saying, and to either bring them on a table and negotiate, or to bring yourself on the table with both of them at some point of time or the another and draft out a policy that is that works in the betterment of the region. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Anushka. So I'm calling Sahil to just give a formal end to this session. Sahil.
Thank you so much, sir. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Tej Singh, sir, for giving us such a vast knowledge about this whole theme, especially about the Indian Ocean region and how it is evolving. And we are seeing new partners and new confronts in this region, but at the end, white sense prevail. So with this, I'd like to thank Sir quite a lot, and also to our fellow presenters who gave their insights and how we could find new solutions to this issue. Now, I'd request Dr. Nagaleshwi ma'am to conclude for the day. Ma'am.
Thank you. Is Professor Tej Pratap Singh sir here? Yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. I'm here. I'm here listening.
I just came in between earlier because I was worrying whether if your battery goes down. Anyway, let me formally thank you and also all the presenters, excellent presenters. You have done a really good, fair job in your while presenting. Just keep it up, and I'm really proud of my students. And of course, I do convey special thanks to Ms. Anushka, Lady Shri Ram College for Women. The principal, Professor Suman Sharma, is very well known to me. So just give my regards. I just take this opportunity to extend that also to you. And thank you everyone, and special thanks to Tej Pratap Singh sir. It was an excellent session.